Welcome to the Developer Service YouTube channel. On today's episode, we're going to be creating a web application for searching podcasts using FastAPI, Jinja2 and podcastindex.org, their API. Let's take a quick look on how is the application working. You can see we can search for the subject, for instance. We can see the list of podcasts. We can click and see the one list of episodes, and we can even play the episode in question, and we can see this later on. As usual, this video is based on the blog post that you can find in the Developer Service blog, and also you can get the source code from there. I'll leave a link in the description for both the source code and for the blog post. Let's see now how we can implement this application. So let's now take a look at the code. As you see, I have a PyCharm here project here. It's a FastAPI project, so we're going to be using, as mentioned, FastAPI. So in terms of the requirements, we have obviously FastAPI. We have UVCon for running the server for FastAPI. We have Jinja2 for the templates. We have the podcast index Python library to interface with their API. And we have Python decouple to use the environmental variables. So as mentioned, we're going to be using podcastindex.org, their API. So you can go to podcastindex.org and you can sign up for the API. You just click on the API there and you sign up, and you will receive an email with your even login credentials, but also with your API key API key and secret that you can immediately use. So to keep our API key secret, our API key and our secret, we're going to be using an environmental variable file with the podcast index API key and the API secret. You would obviously need to replace with your own API key and your own API secret that you will get after signing up to the podcastindex.org API. And now let's take a look at the rest of the code. So in terms of the files necessary to implement this application in FastAPI, we have our podcast index wrapper, which is responsible for the interface with the podcast index API. We have our main file, which has the FastAPI app and also the different endpoints that we are going to need. We have our template files. We have a base template file where we set up the general structure for the page. We are importing Bootstrap 5 because that's what we're going to be using to styling the web page. And then we have our index file, which is also our search web page, and also the episodes where we have the details of, or the list of episodes for a particular podcast. So now let's take a look at the code itself. So we start with the podcast index wrapper file. So we're importing our podcast index. This is the library that we have installed through the requirements. We're importing our config from decouple so we can use the API keys. The first thing we are doing is we are setting our API key and secret to these local variables inside the file. We are defining a config indexed dictionary, which contains the API key and the API secret. And with this config indexed, we're creating an instance of our podcast indexed through the init method and passing in the config index. That will generate this an instance of podcast index that you can use later on. In terms of the methods that we have in this file, only two methods we are going to need. We're going to need one method to search the podcasts, which will receive a query, which is a string, and the get podcast episodes, which will receive a podcast ID, which is an integer file. So the search podcasts, we're just doing the index, which is our podcast index instance, just calling the search method on that. We're passing in the query, and we're saying clean equals true, which means it does not return the mature content. So clean is true, just returns the clean content, let's call it like that. Then we're storing that in the result variable, and we are going to be returning the result in feeds, which feeds contains the list of the podcasts. When we want to get the list of episodes for a particular podcast, we use the get podcast episodes. Again, we are using our instance of the podcast index with the index variable. We're going to get the episodes by the feed ID, and the feed ID is the podcast ID, which we will receive in this function, which is an integer. Again, starting in the result, and the result items dictionary contains the list of episodes that we will use later on in the code. Next up, we have our main file. So we are obviously importing FastAPI and request. We're importing temp link from Jinja templates, we're importing our two methods that we just saw from our podcast index wrapper, and also datetime, so we can do some datetime calculation later on. We start by creating our FastAPI app with FastAPI. We're setting up our templates to be the Jinja2 templates with the directory templates. So as you can see, the HTML files that I showed later was inside the templates folder. So that's the directory that we're passing here. Then we're defining a startup event. In this we're using the decorator app on event, in this case the startup event. And this method is used to instantialize a Jinja2 custom filter. That's why the templates and filters. And we're going to create a filter template to date, which is just going to receive a timestamp in the Unix format, and it's just going to convert that from our timestamp, and will convert that into a string with the year, month, and date. After that, we have our root API endpoint, which is also the search endpoint. So it will receive the request, of course, and it will receive the search string, which is a query. By default, it's an empty string. We're just instantiating our results list. Then if we have a search query, we're going to be using the search podcast function we defined before, with passing in the query, and we're storing the results there. And then we're going to be rendering the HTML page, this case the index.html, which we'll see in detail later on, by doing templates, which is from Jinja2, and doing the template response so that the HTML file is processed, and we're passing in as variables, so the request and the results, and also the query, the results to show, and the query also to be able to use it inside the template. When the user selects a particular podcast, we have an endpoint to see the details of that podcast, so the list of episodes, and we pass in a podcast ID. We're also going to pass in the query for that endpoint so that we can do the back button and still maintain our query. So this is the definition of our endpoint with the function podcast episode. So it will receive a request as usual, the podcast ID, which is an integer, and also the string search queen, which can also be empty. So we're using the get podcast episode function that we defined before, starting that into the episodes, and again doing our Jinja template, the episodes.html, passing in the request, passing in the list of episodes, and also passing in the query. And in case you are running this as the main file, we're importing the UVcorn and running it as a UVcorn app, or you can also run it in the command line by using the Python or the UVcorn run. So now that we have taken a look at our code, let's take a look at our HTML templates that will generate the pages. So we have our page HTML file, which has the title of the app. It has a link so that we can import the CSS style sheets from Bootstrap to do some styling of the page. We're defining a container here, which has the blog content, which will replace later on in the different child pages of this base HTML. And we're also importing the JavaScript for Bootstrap, which we'll need later on. Then we have our index HTML file, which is our third page. So we're extending our base HTML template, and we're extending our blog content. We're setting up a heading with a title. We're setting up our form, our search form, where we can type in our search query. So we're defining the method as a get. This is how we're going to pass to the API endpoint. We're passing it to the root API endpoint. Then we're defining an input group so that we can put our label, and also our input button with we receive the query. We're pre-filling that with the query and the default value of empty, and we're also setting up a placeholder search. And of course, we have our button that will submit the form to the FastAPI endpoint. It's just a simple submit button, which we're styling as the primary button. After that, we have our list. So when we perform the search, so initially we will only be rendering the form. After a search has been performed, we'll have our results, and we're going to be rendering for each of the results. We're going to be rendering a bootstrap card, That's pretty much what we're defining here, as you see, with the card. So there will be an initial image if that has been passed or it is available in the podcast details on the item image, because we're iterating the results with the item. If that is the case, we'll show that image. If there is not an image present, we are going just showing a placeholder image, and also with the indication that no image is available. Then we have the body of the card, in that we are going to be showing the podcast title, and we're also going to be showing the description, which are truncating to 150 characters, because some podcasts might have a very extensive description. And we're also setting up a default in case there is no description. There's no description available. Finally, we have the footer of the card, and that will contain our URL so that we can go into the podcast details and see the episode list. So we're getting the URL for a particular endpoint. Podcast episodes is the name of the function that you see here, and that's how Jinja2 will recognize the URL. And we're passing in our podcast ID, which is our item ID, because our item is a podcast. And we're also passing in the search query so that we can utilize the back button in the next template. And of course, we're repeating this iteration for all of the podcasts that are written in the results. Let's now take a look at our episodes.html file. So again, we're extending our page HTML template. We're overriding our blog content. So again, we have a heading with the podcast episode, the title. We also have a link that performs back to the list or to the search of the podcast, and we're going back to the root and passing in the query parameter so that the API endpoint can load again the same query. And then we're just doing a list of cards, which will provide the details of the episode. List means that each podcast episode will be in one single line. So again, same principle. We're iterating through the episodes with the episode variable. So if the podcast episode has an image, we're going to be showing that image. And if not, then our image source is going to be a placeholder. Then we have our card body. In this case, is a very relative body that we're having the title with our episode title. Then we have, possibly, if that is present in the podcast episode, going to be having the season and the episode which that podcast episode belongs to, and we're filling in that if in case that is present, like I mentioned. Then we have a paragraph with our episode description. We're putting in that as safe, so if there is any HTML present in the podcast description, that can be rendered. Again, we are truncating to 150, and we have our default of no description available in case there is no description there. And then we're going to have a small footnote indicating the date in which the podcast episode was published. And so we have our episode date published, and we're using our Jinja2 custom filter that we just defined, the timestamp to date, because this date published is a timestamp value, and we're converting that to a proper date format. And finally, we're doing audio controls so that we can actually have the audio player or playing the content of the podcast episode. We're passing in as a source, which is the episode enclosure URL, which contains the URL for the MP3 file, or for the file itself, the audio file for that episode, and we're tagging in this as an audio and MPEG. In case the browser does not support, it will actually render that the browser does not support the audio element, but most modern browsers should be able to support the audio player. And that is it. That is all the code and templates that is necessary to create this podcast search application. Let's now see it in action. So I'm going to run the FastAPI with UVcorn. As you see, UVcorn running. Let me click on the link. So we have our application, which is our title, our search box, our search button. So let me search for the tech podcasts. And we have several different ones. Let's take a look, for instance, to the Gadget Lab. So I can see the episodes of that podcast by clicking the link. As you can see, the list of the podcast episodes. And there's our card occupying one single line, which is of the episode. And I can even play the content of one. Let's hear it a little bit.
Here on Gadget Lab, we dive deep into the tech universe, tackling questions like, is giving companies access to your genetic material a good idea? And are the latest phone releases...
And of course, we can go back to the list and it will still maintain our search query. We might need to scroll again, but it will maintain our search query. And that is it. That is all the steps necessary to implement our podcast search application. Thank you for watching. Like this video if you like this content. Subscribe to this channel for more content about Python, Django, AI, and random web applications. And until next time, happy coding!